Welcome to Cabaret Voltaire. I'm Salome Hall, the director, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation between Mai-Thu Perret and Ida Soulard tonight. The talk is organized in collaboration with FOYER in Process and moderated by Yasmin Afshar. She's part of the FOYER team together with Joya Dalmolin and Gabrielle Schad. So thank you all for being here. This conversation is organized in the context of the exhibition Ich bin wütend with Mai-Thu Perret and Sophie Taeuber-Arp in the vaulted cellar downstairs of the Cabaret Voltaire. The show is still on until the end of this month, so if you want to have a look. But the concept of Le Foyer is not to discuss current exhibition, but to give a glimpse into the future, into unfinished projects. And tonight it's an upcoming book project by the artist Mai-Thu Perret and the art historian Ida Soulard. However, I think the conversation will be very informative for the exhibition. There are many topic fields downstairs in the exhibition, for example, the relation between abstraction and expression and language, but also abstraction and arts and crafts. And the abstraction or the Sophie Taeuber's abstraction was in the beginning of her artistic process and not in the end, as it was with many of her, especially male, or many of them were male colleagues. And this was because she transferred the orthogonal concept in the textile art into vertical and horizontal compositions as early as in 1915. And until 1929, she was mainly exhibited or working in the context of the arts and crafts. For example, she exhibited in Zurich in 1916 in the Zürcher Kunstgewerbemuseum in 1916 in February, the same month as the Dadaists founded Cabaret Voltaire in this very room. So we are sitting in the historical Cabaret Voltaire, and Sophie Taeuber-Arp was of course a part of the Dada movement. And Mai-Thu Perret as well as Ida Soulard are very interested in the arts and crafts movement of the 20th century and also the fiber art movement, and that's why we also included students of Sophie Taeuber-Arp like Elsie Schurk in the show downstairs. We will open the exhibition again after the conversation if you want to have a look. There are also exhibition texts, but now enjoy the talk and thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Salome, and thank you all, the whole team of Cabaret Voltaire for hosting or inviting us. It has, I just thought this morning, it's actually, hopefully, the last COVID pendency I had, because we actually started to have a conversation about doing a Le Foyer talk with Mai-Thu Perret in 2019. So this has had a long time to grow, and so we are super happy that we are here, and although we are not anymore really talking about how this exhibition came together, because it is here, looking more to the next project, it's still very nice that we have this opportunity, and also because also we as Le Foyer have had collaborations with Mai-Thu before, and and we always wanted to come to Salome and to the Cabaret Voltaire as well. So yeah. Yes. So about Le Foyer in Process, we have been doing this nomadic format since 2018. The idea is, as Salome said, not to talk about the finished artwork, but about the process that leads to it. So we do conversations about artistic processes, but also curatorial processes, editorial processes, process leading to film works, exhibitions, or even museums. and so on and so forth. And also as a bit of a teaser announcement, it was a bit more quiet around us. We didn't do that many talks, but we are now also in the process, obviously, always, of doing a bit of a reorganization also, and you will hear about from us more in the upcoming months also. And yeah, so just that you also show yourself, Joya and Gabriel, there are many also familiar faces. And also for these conversations, it's a bit also the concept that we don't have a projection, that we have books and prints here, that we are sitting around this big table. So please also join the conversation and ask your questions anytime you want. You don't need to wait until the end and the Q&A. So I will start with a short introduction to the two guests, and yeah, then we will also look at the material we have here and then follow the conversation. So Mai-Thu Perret is an artist based in Geneva. Most of you know her. Literature, art, and cultural history, as well as spiritual traditions and feminist theory, form the intellectual foundation of her work. She engages with the artistic avant-gardes in the early 20th century, especially with the history of abstraction and questioning the capitalist and patriarchal conventions of art, and creates counter-narratives to them. Perret has had numerous solo exhibitions at institutions, including Istituto Svizzero Rome, curated by Joya, Mamco Geneva, Badischer Kunstverein, Karlsruhe, Spike Island, Bristol, National Sculpture Center, Dallas, San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, and the Renaissance Society in Chicago. Ida Soulard is a PhD in art history and independent curator based in Paris. She is a co-director of Glass Dead, a bilingual online research platform and art journal. From 2013 to 2020, she was artistic director of Fieldwork Marfa, an international research and residency program jointly led by the School of Fine Arts in Nantes and HEAD in Geneva. She recently curated Transmeare, an exhibition collaboration with artist Ulla von Landburg at Frac Amiens in 1833, and Une jeune fille, une machine et leur amitié at Image Orthez. She is an expert on Anni Albers. We also have her book here. She's the editor of the French edition of Anni Albers' iconic 1965 book, and also for Manual for a Future Desert, published with Moose in 2022. So thank you for coming. So as we heard, this conversation will not be about the show we see here, but about an upcoming monograph. So we will talk about how it is to make a book or a monograph. How we will mainly talk about the dialogue, which will be part of that book in form of an interview. You called it also the backbone of the book, and we will have some insights also in how you approach that. We will talk about relationship between text and images, and how either the text can drive the images or the iconography in the book, or the other way around. We will talk about the challenges of representing a circular practice, and we will probably also talk about how it is to talk about art, to get a bit of an understanding of these what we call now ongoing dialogue that you have. Maybe you could quickly, or it depends on how long you want to explain it, but where did you meet, and then how did this kind of interest into each other's practices started?
So actually, Ida and I haven't known each other for very long. This was, I embarked on this project of doing a new monograph about a year ago or something like this. It's a thing that's been sort of on the back burner for a while that I previous book is now 12 years old, which is, and there is a ton of material that has accumulated since then, and I like making books and I miss it. And I wanted for this book to try to go beyond the usual collaborators, because I've worked with some people repeatedly and have very good relationships with some writers and curators, but I wanted to try to sort of branch out and try to work with people that were maybe not necessarily always involved in my work, to go out of my family, so to speak. And I think I read some of your writing about Albers, I think maybe some things in Glass Beads, and I had a sort of how I do these things. I keep a little note in my phone, and I have some names on it of people that maybe one day I could talk to, I would be interested. And I ran the note by Clément Dirier, who's the editor at JRP, that with whom I did the previous book, so we know each other quite well, and he was very enthusiastic about the suggestion, and so we got in touch with you. This is really how it happened, and I was also curious to work with someone that had, it seemed to me, was had a lot of interests that were cogent with mine, but that I didn't necessarily know personally, because it's interesting to have do something new or talk to people. So this was the idea.
Yeah, on my end, when Clément called me and was like, do you want to write something with Mai-Thu in a collaboration? And he insisted on the fact that it would be like a long-term collaboration, that he was like, she doesn't want, someone who just like produce a text and then, be, and I got really excited because I knew some of Mai-Thu's work, obviously, and, but I didn't know it that well. And it's also the way I collaborate with artists. I stopped doing, art critique a long time ago. I like long-term commitment to artists and people you can work with for one text and then collaborate again on different format and follow the work and really dive into it. So I got really excited, and then so I said yes immediately.
Yeah, and then you came to the studio and we met. I think the idea was to try to. Also, in terms of the book itself, the main problem is what do you do when you have 12 years of quite a lot of imagery and projects and a lot of different projects. And there's like a lot of different corpuses of work, I guess, and how on earth do you structure this thing, and you don't want to make a book that's like, a phone book. So it's like trying to find, a way through the material. And Clément and I thought that one interesting way, instead of trying to impose a structure, from now on, was to write an interview together with Ida, and then somehow use that as, as showing us the way how to organize the material. Because it's been, I still frankly have no idea how these things are going to be structured and organized, but I think it will come into place afterwards. And there are some other texts in the book. There's a short text by Giovanna Zapperi, but I don't know what Giovanna's going to write about. So this is she's very into myth at the moment, so I went to her. So Giovanna's art historian, and she specializes in I think was a lot of Italian feminism, and she especially now she's teaching art history in Geneva. She has the job as she's the professor of art history. Modern art history in Geneva, and she just did her inaugural lecture, which I went to hear, and it was about Abby Warburg and the figure, I don't know how you say it in English, but that sort of figure of the nymph, the moving nymph that you see in a Ghirlandaio painting. Anyways, it's a very long and interesting argument, and the relationship between that and the new woman, and I have no idea how any of that could potentially go with my work, but I know she mentioned myth, and I think it's interesting, but it will be a much shorter text. And I'm interested in, I was interested in having it back and forth, and and it not being like when you get a bunch of questions through email and you answer it, and then you print it. So
yeah, I think when I came to Mai-Thu studio, we went through a lot of images. I went through a lot of those images before.
Yeah, and I
And
sent
then
you
I-
all these WeTransfers, which was kind of like...
Yeah, and then I asked the publisher, I was like, so how are you going to structure this? And he was like, I think you're going to structure this together.
We're all like, hey.
So, but also one of the things we discussed with Mai-Thu is this question of the way her work. It's also difficult to. So one of the things I was interested in, and also that interested me in Anni Albers' work, is it's works that are difficult to categorize or to put in one category. And when you go through Mai-Thu's work, there is some recursivity. Objects come back, and they come back 10 years after in a slightly different form. So it's quite difficult to, if you go chronologically, it makes sense, but then you get very frustrated because some things are coming back and you don't know how to translate this into a linear form that is a text or an interview.
Yeah, in a way you would want to make a book that's a circle, but that's or a figure eight or
Yeah.
something, and that's of course not really possible. So I mean, yeah, that's a problem.
So,
So,
Ida,
yeah.
how did you, because I think it would be also interesting as you have a lot of us editing experience, so how did you kind of approach that problem in the case of Anni Albers, which could ideally maybe be a best practice example, or do you have
Yeah.
like a...
Well, Anni Albers, honestly, I didn't solve the problem or resolve the problem. So Anni Albers was my PhD that I finished last June, and for a while I was playing with this idea of having some kind of trans-thematic way of approaching her work. And the more I was doing this, the more I was like circling around, and it was becoming absolute nonsense because I was going from like 1927 to 1982, like in one sentence. So in the end, it's just a chronological book, where I tried at times to make those connections with, trying to show how some, at the end of the book, showing how things from the beginning are coming back in a different way. Because also I think her practice was more a practice of layering. So at the end of her life, you could find issues that she worked with at the Bauhaus at the very beginning, but that were really simplified, or let's say very in a simple way at the Bauhaus, and were highly complexified at the end of her life. So it was, in the end, it was easier to like weave into this. Yeah, this is the book of her text, so that was easier. It was already organized.
Yeah.
Yeah, she did the work.
Yeah.
She did the work.
I'm sorry.
So, and now in your case, you have a time frame, which is basically
I mean,
departing from the last book. Maybe we can also show that one. This is...
Yeah, but this is very particular. So I made other books, but they're much smaller or very specific to an exhibition, so it doesn't really make sense. But this, which is actually like this, was supposed to have a see-through, transparent Bible paper cover. But hey, the publisher, it's 15 years ago and I'm still pissed. They showed up with this and they didn't want to change it. So this was the first monograph I did, and this is something that I did with an editor called Christoph Keller, who at the time had done a lot of work with a publishing company he founded called Revolver. It was a German publishing company that did a lot of artist book, and he was also a kind of a genius graphic designer. And so I made this first book with him, and this was very much a kind of artist book, and it was less material, so it was a little bit easier. And this is arranged by sections, and there are recurring sections within the book, and then there are different types of paper that correspond to different types of works or different types of sections, and there is a kind of long, almost chronological, almost like a film strip, and it goes over the page, so somehow the pictures are not each to a page, you kind of roll over. It's like a libretto that would be folded, and there is a running commentary that is my description of the artworks on each of the works, and then some other series that are more specific, like a video installation called An Evening of the Book, or my first ceramic wall reliefs. These are all like set up as a separate cahier or something like that. Leaf, how do you say? They're booklets in the book, I guess. And then there's like some fake archive material as well that we pretended that we made a fake microfilms in effect. So we had this idea. This book is from 2007, and there was this idea that I don't know if any of you remember working in libraries back in the times before everything was online or everything was digital, but you could get a lot of documents on microfilms, and then you would have a light table and you would have all your documents kind of piled up, and you would have this kind of beautiful abstract arrangement, these arrangements of these black and white documents, transparencies, and so we did this with a lot of images that are archival images that are basically images from art history, and these sort of, it's very a bit strange. They are fake footnotes to a reprint of Huysmans' Arnaud. Don't ask me why. In the book, I've always been obsessed with that book, and I've always been I've also been obsessed with footnotes, and with things kind of like in a Nabokov book where you would have a second book that would run into footnotes, for example, or where you would have more, like for example, Pale Fire, you have more footnotes than text. That's sort of ideal. So we did something like this with the illustration. So we pretended that the artworks I had selected were illustrations to the novel, but of course it's not true. Juxtaposition. So this was a very kind of free-form book, and made it's a one-of-a-kind in effect. And then I made this other book, the orange one, also with JRP, but this is part of what the publisher at the time, someone with very specific ideas, called a series. And so this was his monograph series, and there were types. Basically, they are like kind of
specific format.
Yeah, they're formats for also for marketing the books and selling them and so on, so that there is some amount of flexibility in the format. Somehow goes with the work of the artist that is inside, but more or less all the books on all the different artists that are published within this series are kind of the same. And I think they were copying the Phaidon books.
Yeah.
I mean, not copying, but you know what I mean. They were basing. This was that monograph format, which is very successful. It's something like that. I mean, he would kill me if he heard me, but this is basically what it is. So in effect, this book, which I did with a graphic designer called Gilles Gavier, who was a very good friend, and who I think will design the next one. This is slightly different because I didn't feel. I mean, I was expressly told that I couldn't do what I had done with that.
Yeah.
And I think with the new book, it's going to be more like the first one.
Yeah. And here you have to design and you fill in the content more or less, or.
I mean, I think there is a kind of a template. For example, I mean, the cover material. That shiny cover material is specific. All the books have the same material. So.
And now here with that book, if I understood right, and also the task you or the job you have now is basically that the design is probably not yet a previous topic. So you first kind of organize and yeah.
Yeah, for now we are like what we said. I think we're 1/3 of the
interview, not even organizing the materials.
It's gonna be the longest interview.
You may have to cut it.
You definitely will have to cut it.
It is long. I mean,
but it's also, that's one of the issue, but which is a beautiful issue, is that the footnotes I understand, because in your work you have like it's always super stratified. Like every work comes from either a literary piece, then or like some poetry or some historical reference, and then it's layered with other kinds of references, and also joyful accident, like the Ettore Sozzas machine that you performed with. Maybe you can talk about this so people understand. Like,
so this is a very good example of sort of geeking out on the detail, but that actually is very significant. In this performance, so we have, this is where we did our work and printed that. So So here, these are pictures from a performance called Figures that I did with a dancer, a musician, and a singer-songwriter in Geneva. It toured otherwise, but it was a performance that I did in 2014 called Figures, and it was a collaboration. It's a recurring part of a recurring set of collaborations with a singer, songwriter, poet, friend of mine called Tamara Barnett-Herron. We worked together also for the show at the Instituto, and we also worked together for the show in Spike Island in Bristol. So this is really, she's a sort of a person that I very often work with. And the piece, to try to make this quite quick, is a performance based on, the idea was to make a marionette, life-size, a puppet, that would have changing faces, and the faces were realistic silicone faces. There were three masks, and each of these masks are basically a personality. So there is this body that cruises through history and time, and has these faces that come off. And she's, and this marionette is based on a Japanese art form called bunraku, which is a traditional form of Japanese puppetry where people perform on a stage. It's quite classic Japanese theater, so it's like in effect. You have a stage and you have a narrator who speaks and is the voice of the characters, a kind of ventriloquist almost, I mean someone who speaks, and then you have a musician. And then you have manipulators who are moving puppets, and they're dressed in black and they're on stage with the puppet. And there's different types of bunraku, but there are some of the puppets are really big, and you have 3 manipulators. And unlike Western puppet theater, where in the Western puppet theater you don't see the people moving the puppet, like in the Sicilian puppet theater or in the Théâtre de Guignol or whatever, you have a box. I mean, it can be a really big box, but nonetheless, you have a box, and the people moving the puppets are hidden. And the whole point of bunraku is that it's not hidden; they are there, and you have this dance of the real and what is moving. The object and the people who are moving it is constantly visible, and it's a very beautiful. In effect, it's a very beautiful dance form. It's maybe a bit like Japanese shadow puppets, where you also can see the people moving the puppets if you go behind the screen, but it's a non-illusionistic art form, and I was always the first time I saw pictures of some of these performances, I was obsessed with these people moving marionettes on stage, and it has a lot to do with this type of stuff, which are mannequins, and I've been making mannequins for a very long time, and I guess it's a classic of Western literature, art history. The mannequin comes to life, the puppet comes to life. It's like Hoffman, this T.A. Hoffman. It's a very classic thing, and so I thought, okay, we're going to make a bunraku play with this marionette, and the marionette. But then, of course, the marionette is very simplified. It's actually a shop mannequin that's quite quite, I would say, simply transformed, so actually it didn't move very well. It has these realistic faces, and it has a dancer called a woman called Anja Schmidt who moves it. And then on the side there is my friend Tamara who's singing, and there is this musician called Beatrice Dillon who's making the music. And somehow this marionette starts become, the first figure is a goddess, an Indian mystic. The second figure is a shaker, so an American mystic from the 18th century. The penultimate figure is a coder, so a woman who writes code for computers and who clearly is having a mental breakdown. And the last figure is an artificial intelligence. I think I decided to step in and replace the puppets and somehow just show myself typing. And that would be like a reporter reporting on the AI. And in the piece, I decided to use this Valentine typewriter, which is that red Ettore Sottsass typewriter from 69, something like that. And this typewriter is a fascinating object because it's like an icon of design. You see it in every single design museum. You see this pop red typewriter that you could move. It's in a plastic case. But it's also interesting because, in effect, it's kind of like a portable computer, like a laptop, like a MacBook or something. But before you had the technology to make a MacBook, because Sotsas before that worked on this enormous computer program with Olivetti in the 60s, where he designed these room environments for computers. And it was a very odd project to ask a designer to make computers at a time when computers were like, bigger than that bar. I mean, at that time, a computer was not a thing like this. A computer was like an enormous room, and I think the American versions, like IBM and so on, they were enormous things that looked terrible, and nobody really cared so much about the design. But I guess because this was Italy, they had Sotsas design, and it looks amazing, and it's beautiful, kind of very sparse, kind of science fiction room. And he had this whole theory about how you had to make it very clean and lab-like, and you had to not have wires everywhere, and you had to somehow completely streamline this experience of the computer. So he was really thinking also about what the computer was promising. And later, for the same company, Olivetti, he designed this typewriter. And his idea was okay, let's take the typewriter out of the workplace of the secretary. Let's take it out of the office, because typewriters at the time were these bulky things that sat on the desk. Let's make it a thing that goes in a plastic box and is pop and is cool and is light, and you can take it with you to the store, you can take it with you to the cafe, and so you can sit at the cafe and you can write a poem, or I don't know, do your, it's 69, and sit at the cafe typing. And it's such a stupid idea, but it's also so beautiful and cool. And of course, this is exactly what everyone is doing now with laptops everywhere. It's actually becoming a kind of a problem, because you can't go to a cafe without having people typing everywhere. And it's just, that's sort of, in a way, typically the kind of thing I'm interested in. It's these moments, where history doesn't happen, or almost happened, or could have happened differently. What if, what if computer technology was Italian and not, American? And how much big, how would it look if it was all made by Sotsas and not, what's his name, Johnny Ives or whatever, to get Johnny Ives, the guy from California. I mean, I think it's very interesting, all of this stuff. Or maybe it's just that this technology was waiting to be born, and it ended up being born anyways. But yeah, so I guess this is what the type of recursive. But so this is a footnote that is more than a footnote. And then,
and this is just one object of the performance.
Yeah, to add another weird thing to it, it's like, so we're working with this woman, Beatrice, and we talk about this typewriter and about Sotsas, and she's like, oh, it's so amazing, my mother is an industrial designer, and she worked with Sotsas in Italy on the Olivetti project, which is also, what is the chance of the coincidence of you, your friend, picking a musician to work on a performance, and she turns out to have so in our liner, in our notes, our program notes, we have a picture of the mom at a computer, and it's really gorgeous. Absolutely 70s pictures or 60s pictures of this own dress. You see this huge console. Yeah.
So there are layers of different kinds of narratives, whether it's personal, some kind of joyful accidents that happens with the performers you work with, the relationship you have with those performers. And we also have like a lot of in common, a lot of obsessions, so let's say in common. And this exactly, and this history that is now quite mainstream, but that leads from the textile workshop in the Industrial Revolution and through the Jacquard cart, that was also the beginning of this twofold history of the textile history and computing history. And so there are a lot of writers that, like Sadie Plant, who wrote this book, The Zeros Plus Ones, that I think we have a lot of text or books also in common, and those kind of narratives are interesting to push, but also to question, like by example, this figure of the woman represented with a machine has been a lot, got a lot of success in the past years, like because it's very glamorous. You have those human computing elements or those women with high heels next to the telephone machines, and there is a whole history also of the use of those images. So it always has this textile, as most of the objects that you work with, I believe, are many-sided, and so they have, they can go in the foreground. There are objects that can go in the background. It really depends on the light we put on it. Like the Torres Sotsas machine can become like just an object among many, or it can become on the forefront. So it's also this, in the conversation we have, it's also this difficulty of what do you put in front, what do you put in the back, or do you lay everything, but like laying everything would be like almost a Borgesian kind of attempt.
Yeah,
but,
it's like the making a map of, a one-to-one map.
Exactly.
I mean, at this point it's not possible, I think.
But it's also, I think, the nature of the objects that you work with, and maybe this is, this is a question we haven't really addressed yet in the conversation. But those objects, textiles, ceramics, they're also they have a history that is many-sided, and of course, every object is inhabited by those many histories. So it's. It's a complicated but super exciting task, I feel. Also, like how do you? It's crazy that it's still a question, but this divide between fine arts and what is considered crafts, or those kind of media such as ceramics or textiles, that it feels it still needs some kind of justification to exist in the fine art departments somehow. Even though, of course, there are so many theoreticians and art historian artists who opened and worked with those divides to make things more porous, but it still has some difficulty in it, and some difficulty to navigate between different kind of categories. So that's also an interesting point that we're working with, I think.
I don't know, maybe one other aspect going into this direction is you have a lot of like fictional moments also in your work, and then a lot of like actual historical references. So we were speaking about footnotes and about like making actual references that are historically researched and so on and so forth. But then you have a lot of like stories and speculation and fiction in the work as well. So how is this a topic also of your conversation, or how do you kind of work with that also in your, because there are a lot of like circles, but there are also a lot of translations, right? So how do you kind of work with that?
Yeah, I think this is one of the first questions I asked Mai-Thu, is about the position of the fiction in your work, talking about all these different words. Like there's some storytelling, narratives, and fiction to me is
the last
really,
question I didn't answer. You mean?
I know, yeah. So maybe it's
Here we go.
It's my way to ask it again.
Yeah,
no, but it's also because I feel it's coming back in different nature. But I think fiction also has some kind of, and the way you use it, I feel, has some kind of political traction in it, which maybe storytelling doesn't have. We're also in societies that are so fed with storytelling that it's interesting to see how this works in your work. But maybe, I don't know, like...
But I think storytelling in the sort of marketing type, the way that in French, when you say storytelling, you already know that it's a bad thing, and it's what politicians do, and it's what advertisers do, and so on. And it's like adding a layer that makes people believe in something, or somehow that it makes it more attractive. But I think fiction doesn't kind of derealizes things in a way, more than make them, what's the word in French, c'est pas un truc de véracité du tout. Alors que le storytelling, en fait, c'est une façon de donner une forme de véracité aux choses. If it's an emotional, you're pretending to add an emotional truth like an emotional story, but actually is like a bullshit person. Like my mother-in-law thought that, okay, this is very Swiss. You know, Betty Bossy, the things that you find in the supermarket. It's like a brand. It's like a fake brand. She really thought that this person had existed. She was, you know, and I was like, no, of course she didn't exist. She's like a marketing invention, and then, of course, Wikipedia. And it's like, I think she's actually, yeah, I don't remember who or where she was invented, but of course she's like a fictional construct that's used to sell things, and I think that's not, you know, obviously that's not really the type of fiction that we're interested in. But it's maybe the use of speculation, I guess, you know, and also because what is presented as historical truth is often, you know, complicated or more, you know, more complex than what we thought, or one-sided. And I think fiction is a way to sort of, you know, somehow open up things and think about them differently.
But I think it's also the way you cross different, you know, different stories. Like in Les Guerrières, it's like you have this maybe like historical part coming from the Kurdish women fighting in Rojava, and Les Guerrières by Monique Wittig.
This was almost like an ethical issue for me, because so this project, Les Guerrières, is a project I made 2016. And it stemmed from, it's very often, I mean, I think very often for me, it's like the encounter of two or more things. Very often the encounter of a place. In this case, this place, the National Sculpture Center in Dallas, where explicitly it was like make an exhibition of new works, but this museum that is, you know, primarily devoted to the exhibition of a collection of modernist sculpture. So the collection, it begins, you know, Rodin, Gauguin, it's like, they have, I mean, it's a very beautiful collection, but it's about sculpture. And I don't make only sculpture, so when I was invited to do this show, I thought, okay, maybe it's interesting to actually really focus on sculpture, and focus again on the figurative sculptures, the mannequins, the figures, like this one. Because I hadn't done it for a while. I think also this is typically what happens when you're an artist and you do more than one thing. Maybe one thing gets more attention at a certain point, and then you get a little bit like, because everybody's like sort of, you know, wants you to make more of the things that everybody likes, and then you're trying to do something else, so you kind of put it on hold for a while, and then this is what happened to me. I think with the mannequins, it was a time when I was just like, I'm not going to make. I'm going to have a break from making all these figures, because otherwise that's all I'm going to do is like these paper mache, you know, mannequins, and it's becoming a shtick, and I don't really like it. And so I kind of stopped doing it for a while, and then I think by the time the Nasher came around, I sort of waited enough that it was interesting again. So it was like, okay, I want to reconsider my relationship to, basically statuette, mannequin, this whole continuum between a shopfront mannequin and a statue and a mummy, I guess. Like this whole, you know, thing, which it's a huge area. And so there was this question, and then there was just a terrible political moment that we were in, because Trump was about to get elected. It was in Texas, which is a very particular place and kind of scary, you know, and not in Marfa, I mean in Dallas, in a place where you know, it's all money, and I mean it's a very strong place in a way. And also in Europe and in the Middle East, there was a war in Syria. There was ISIS. There was the whole thing with the Kurdish people fighting for you know, this enclave of Rojava in the north of Syria. And then there was the Bataclan. Terrorist attack in November, which was, I think, completely destroyed. I mean, completely destroyed everyone. It was a very dark moment. It was like everything was quite awful. And at that time, I had a friend who kept sending me videos of the Kurdish, of the YPJs, the female Kurdish armies in Rojava, because this state of Rojava is structured in a way that it's meant to be equalitarian. And so every structure that exists that has a male part also has a female part. So if you have a male mayor, you need a female mayor. If you have a a male councillor, you need a female councillor. And if you have a male army, you need a female army. And so they made a female army. And there's these videos that are, and it was also, this is also this thing about fiction reality. There was a lot of videos on YouTube that you couldn't really figure out what the status of the videos were, but it was clearly propaganda material. And I've always been interested in agitprop and propaganda, and it was this, so it was videos showing you these girls training in those military camps, but instead of being the bloody ones, because there were tons of horrible videos of people dying and so on, which I really wasn't interested in watching. There was a kind of a subset of videos that was all like girls having fun at the army, which I thought was so sweet, but also so whack. So it's like these videos of girls and they're together and they're making the dishes and they're wearing combat fatigues and they're 16 and they're singing songs, they go visit their mom, and, and then they're like, oh, and I had a fight with this guy from ISIS and I blew his head off, and they'd start talking about how these guys are on drugs or whatever. You're just like, well, okay, so one day they're petting their dog and they're doing all these nice things together, they're singing these songs, and they're a real community. And then at the same time it's kind of shot through with all this violence. And they're kind of together as a community against this violence. I was basically just obsessed. And then at the same time I started reading this Monique book called Les Guerrières, which is a book that I had been told by many people that I had to read it because it was so like my work and foundational for my work and whatever.
So you did not.
So for years I've never read it because I couldn't begin it. It always was hard and I couldn't read it. And then at this point I read it and I just kind of read it in 3 days. I was like in a trance of that book.
What's the title of the book?
It's called Les Guerrières.
Yeah.
Does
it exist in English?
Yeah, it does. I don't know how good the translation is when it's translated. In fact, you can download a PDF for free because it's quite a popular book. But it's like, so this feminist, lesbian radical writer, Monique Wittig, I think 69, writes this book about this army of women that are taking over.
It's like a science fiction.
Yeah, but
feminist.
it's a really interesting science fiction because it's this particularly cool type of science fiction where you don't know if it's the past or the future.
Yeah, and it has a very specific kind of language.
Yeah, and it's constantly quoting from other. It's very intertextual. There's a lot of like quotation that goes into it, and from some stuff that is very from the 70s, like Viet Cong material, and just a lot of interesting things are going on with quotation in that book, and it's completely circular. It's all about the O, the letter O, and anyways.
Sounds really like your work.
Yeah, it's so good. I mean, it's just so, because it's also very incantatory. It's really like a litany in some ways, and it's so. There was this book. Then I thought, okay, I'm going to make these basically sculptures of these women from Rojava, and they're going to be called Les Guerrières. But I always knew that it couldn't be a documentary project because I had no access to the material, and I went to the Kurdish part of Turkey once some years before to make some carpets, but I had I'm not a journalist and I have no knowledge of that situation. It's all like from reading stuff on the internet, so I didn't want to pretend that I was doing anything documentary. And in fact, I was quite nervous about the fact that maybe people could think it was exploitative or something like that, to use that very problematic history and moment and make it into an artwork. I felt quite nervous about that, but I also felt that maybe because I was so nervous about it, it meant that it was a good thing to work with, and that it was a sort of area of tension and had something interesting. And so yeah, I made these figures, and these figures are all composite. They're made from very many different materials and very often collaged. So they have a kind of Dadaist quality to them. I was really thinking of them also in terms of like, Dadaist descriptions of the war, and also, for example, a Hanahar collage, something like that, and how that in a way is a response to, what happened during the war and the sort of social destruction and physical destruction that the war has brought. So yeah, I guess that was the project. So it's kind of a weird collage. And also a lot of the characters have realistic faces, and the faces of friends of mine. So I also have this thing of always trying to insert real people into these stories, which makes it quite freaky if you know the people, because you're like, oh, but that's Latifa, or like that's Laura or whatever, and so it makes them into kind of new people more.
Maybe Ida, I think we will then also open up the conversation, I think, but I mean, when we just listen now a little bit, I think then you could kind of get lost with every single project, go into very many different directions, and then do the link here and do the link there. And I mean, you're very used to write about historical art, but also contemporary art. And how is it, what I would be interested in, because I think I'm more on the side of making books, but then we also have artists who also have to think about book projects and so on. And I think this format of the interview comes up, I think, almost in every second monograph project. And me personally, I find it always very, very challenging, and many times somehow end up not doing it, also because of the very kind of intense editorial process and reworking and so on. So I would be interested a bit also in your...
As a writer.
As a writer, yes,
yeah.
and as an editor and as a writer. So, and when it's about to conceptualize a monograph, and then I think I always have this conversation, shall we do an interview or not? and I would be interested in your experience also, also in comparison to other projects where maybe you have a lot of conversations, but then it's you like writing it and putting it into a form, and now this experience that you're in the middle of it.
Yeah, I think so. I think every time it's a new experience. Like, by example, a few years ago I was supposed to do an interview with musician Eliane Radig. She was 86 years old at the time, so she's a French musician, and people call her like a pioneer of electronic music in France. So she was 86 when I met with her, and I asked, so it was for an interview for some kind of catalog. And when I entered, I was like, may I record this interview? And she was like, no. I was like, okay, so I'm gonna write really fast. And she was like, you're not writing either. I was like, so what do I do? And she was like, I talk, and then you write whatever you want. And I was like, okay, so then I ended up not doing this as an interview and doing it as a text. And I think she was happier with this. And it was interesting because one of the reasons why she was saying, I'm 86, I'm too old for this. Like, I've done thousands of interviews, which is true. And I want to spend the remaining of my time working on my music. So don't take my time. Like, I'm going to talk to you. You'll be one of the last I talk to, and then you leave. And it was great in the end, because so I did this text based on this conversation and on this series of other interviews, and so it became something totally different. But then it really depends on the artist. But I feel it's also a process that you learn so much also about like how you ask the questions. You can, as you say, it's a lot of work, but it's really going deep into someone's work, but not only work, but the way they think, the way they express their work, what they want to express, but what also they do not. There's some kind of like psychological part of it, like what they want to express, but they don't express really, but you have to push this way. So just before Mai-Thu, I did a written interview with an artist, and she's a textile, also in textile, but more like textile design, and now showing in her work in the art world. But she was very shy, and she doesn't really like to talk. So we did a series of conversations, and she doesn't really write either. So we did a series of conversations, and I was like, this is going to be hard. But after a while, she felt more comfortable, and I wrote a lot of her answers in a way, because after a while, I think I knew what she wanted to say, but didn't say. So I wrote some of it, and she was like, this is exactly what I wanted to say. I was like, this is where I'm doing my job well. So I'm just, so I feel like in this case, it was more like a mediation of, you know, like trying to help put the right words on the work. And sometimes, because also she was very shy and she wanted to use some words that to her were like art, you know, on the side of art, and she was more on the side of design. So it was also like some kind of legitimacy moment. And with Mai-Thu, it's very different because it's a written conversation, so we exchange through a shared document. And so I ask the questions, and Mai-Thu writes answers, and then I ask some questions. Sometimes I make some synthesis because, you know, some of my questions also repeat themselves or lead to some repetition. So it's a process of montage and conversation.
Yeah, the shared Google Doc thing is quite good in a way that we have this document and we can go back on it. And,
but one third only of the interview. So
So how long is 1/3? Just like interested in know.
I don't know, 10 pages?
yeah, I would say.
Okay, so it's going to be a big book.
Well, we can also cut it. I mean, I don't know. We may not have to use everything.
Yeah.
It's the same with all the material. There's no point showing every single artwork that was made. You know, I mean, it would be a nice book, but it's different.
Yeah, exactly. And it's also a matter of what we put at the forefront and what remains in the background.
We may edit some stuff out, or I think I don't necessarily think it has to be absolutely everything, but maybe it's better to go wide like this and then reduced rather than start very narrow. And I think it was a good decision. I was afraid of doing a oral interview. I mean, it's because you get this, all this really annoying kind of nonsense of people speaking, which is fun to read in a magazine, but for a book maybe is a bit too much. And also the transcribing makes it very, very long. No, I'm quite happy to do it as a written thing. Also, it means you can retreat to it and then discuss it, which is very different than, okay, let's spend 3 hours together and just talk, and then you get this, transcript.
And then you end up rephrasing every sentence somehow.
Yeah.
So sometimes transcriptions. So.
Yeah, or you do these interviews, these sort of magazine-style interviews, so like, yeah. I used to work for a magazine when I was younger, and I was doing it. I was a translator, and this is exactly what they would send me. They would send me these really, really endless interviews with sometimes a lot of her, and I would translate them into English. It was a good job because there were a lot of. It was easy, but it's really not that interesting.
It used to be also a bit of a style somehow.
Yeah, it was a style. It was a very kind of late 90s way of making a magazine.
And with the book, you will always have the good or also bad thing about it, that it's not over like an exhibition, but it's staying. So the problem with the cover, it stays. But I think this would be also the moment to open.
I think that's the other thing that came across a bit at the beginning of your talk, was how much should a book be like a conceptual book, or like book as artwork, and how much is it a record or an archive, or like, this idea of the monograph, or of this, what you were talking about, that's like 12 years of your work to try and kind of get at that, capture it in a certain form.
I mean, hopefully it's a bit of both, right? Hopefully it can be documenting, past years of work, and conceptually see something interesting about what is a book, I guess. But sure, it's not a completely like artist book in the sense that it's not just an object for the sake of itself, and it has that documentary question. Yeah, but I've struggled with people who, for example, I've had this conversation with a friend who wants me to do an artist book, but he never wants you to reuse any images of existing things in it, because he says if you reuse images of existing things, it's not an artist book anymore. I want to book as artwork, and you are doing a catalog. And I'm like, I'm not doing a catalog because I'm like totally disrupting the images. And he doesn't, he refuses to understand that you can have a kind of parasitic, artistic relationship to your own material, and it's really frustrating. So we haven't done the book, and maybe one day we'll find a solution. I think that.
Maybe just a quick thought on what you said last about the montage technique of this interview that you are doing, and I'm quite fascinated also. Well, I mean, it's a quite common tool to use, the shared Google Doc, and then you all write down your thoughts and this like ping pong of question and answers. But nevertheless, I was like, is then interview still the right word, or how far do you go also in this montage? Because you either also said you retake sometimes. Then we know you retake parts of the answers, or maybe also parts of the questions, and we all know that with Google Docs we are quite free to really put things together also in a new pattern or order, and it could be an endless play or game or work on a text, which then maybe in the end is also something different than just a conversation between the two of you. It's just a thought also when we think about, you said you abandoned art critique, so how we should still write about artistic practices. And I think it's a very, like, somehow simple, but nevertheless very complex and interesting strategy to gather a work by writing in the end, no?
Yeah, I think, well, first, I don't really touch, first I think it's like, you need to trust the other person at some level to be able to also give your text to someone. When I transform the text, it's, in a way, it's either very marginal, or it's like, I know it's a word that she would have said, she could have said otherwise. When I transform, I always mark it. Like, I don't transform without making it obvious. And then we keep the original text always somewhere, so we can go back to it also if necessary. If it's an endless task, I hope not, we'll see. I think what I have in mind also when I do this, it's a question of structure. So it's more like going back to the overall structure and making sure that things are well placed as we go. And so I feel there's still some work to do, but I feel like the first questions are already pretty well laid out, and then we'll go, and sometimes things go back. But I feel it's like writing a text. I think it's the way I work. I worked with my PhD, at least successfully, it seems. So through this montage and going back into the details and going more and more detailed, and it's more a detailed thing, I think, or being the most accurate possible. I don't know if I answered the question. Maybe you want to add something.
I mean, there is something interesting maybe about the fact that we're so used to web pages and things that you can update that it's almost hard in a way to make a book. And actually, before I did that first book, my writing was my Crystal Frontier writing was a web page. It was like it was hosted on the Air de Paris website. They had a guest section, and every week I would send them a post, like a blog post, and it would be added. And it's such a simple structure, but it worked very nicely for the project. So I think there's also this, that even if we're making books that are paper and physical and so on, they are somehow haunted by by the technologies that come after that we know. So you don't look at a book, I think, in the same way today than you did look at a book in the 19th century, because we have all these other ways of making text and images and so on.
Then it also makes sense to spend a lot of time on doing a book, maybe. So
yeah.
So are there other questions? Last one.
I hope it's not too abstract a question. Obviously, you two are coming from weaving narratives, and there is also a material layer of textures in the works, of course, and I've been wondering how you translate the reflection about that the very materiality also that is not only the narrative and all, of course, its intertextual layers, also back to your co-authoring practice. I don't know, maybe it's in the coding, or but what we have in Mai-Thu's work is also a lot of material textures. How is this resurfacing in a sense in your writing or interviewing practices, or is it, I don't know, it's just something that came up.
It's a super good question, so I don't have the answer to that. I think maybe it's mostly like this. I think I understand what you mean, and I think this comes back mostly in also Mai-Thu's answer, and the question of the weaving material is. I don't know if it's really, maybe it should be more. I don't know if it's really in the text right now, except from the question we're asking about, you know, the recursivity, things coming back, things also that flows from one to the next. There is also this, we almost addressed it, but this question of the figure and ground relationship that to me in textile practices is so important because it's co-constructed in one gesture, the figure and the ground. And this is a question that we address conceptually because Mai-Thu's have a lot of figures in her work, very literally, but also this question of, you know, what should be the, like this relationship and this constantly evolving relationship between a figure and the ground, I think is at the center of what we're trying to do. But I don't know if we have it yet, you know, it's
it may be that some of this, I mean, this may be a cop-out, but you could also speak to some of this in the actual design process of the book so that it becomes maybe a more formal element, or a formal element that weaves itself into the textual, that happens post-writing the essay, I guess. I would imagine, because, and there's also, I think, there's another question, which is the question of all this intermediary material and where do we put it, because everything that's there is mostly exhibition views or reproductions, and so there are pictures that have a very clear quality that are reproduction of individual artworks or views of shows, but then there is quite a lot of material that is clearly reference material or preparatory material or text material that was written. For example, typically, what do we do with all the text of all the performances? It should somehow, I feel like it quite importantly should figure in that book, but how? I mean, it's not very long, so it's not like it's going to take over, but, and I think this is we're going to have to figure out how to put these in, and I personally, I like footnotes and I like illustrations on text too, it's nice when you have that figure free, and then you go to figure free, and it's like a black and white vignette or something. And I think this is a thing that we have to use, and I think we will. In fact, I started doing that in Google Doc. I started pasting things, and then I thought, oh, maybe I should stop with that because it's going to get so fake.
Yeah, put them down.
Yeah.
So just when will the book be ready? Do you already have a
I
date?
think it's
So
ready
we can-
next year, or no? Jimmy was like September. I was like,
next year.
no.
September, you mean printed?
Yeah, no way. No. I mean, there's no way. No. I think it should be ready early next year or something like that. I think that's a good.
Great.
I mean, if we waited that, I feel like we waited that long. It's not like you have to rush it. There is this thing of books linked to exhibitions that sometimes you have to push it to be ready to a certain deadline. This in a way,
This one
it's
is
over.
over.
Yeah. But the more you wait, the more material you may have to include at some point.
And the longer the text gets. Yeah, I think that's we can continue also the conversation because the bar is open, and Salome will also say what, or also the exhibition is open.
Exactly. much, Mai-Thu, Ida, and Yasmin, for this conversation. Yeah, the bar is open till midnight, and we open the exhibition again downstairs. It also kind of reminded me, while listening to the talk, that textile and text have the same etymological source, textere, to connect, so it's kind of a lot of material connected, and I'm looking forward to this reconnection of the work of Mai-Thu Perret. Thank you very much.
Thank you.